and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Now, when I'm not on the net, I'm a bit of a foodie. And so one of the things that I was really interested to find out about was what kinds of foods we eat today that the ancient Egyptians had. And I've put a little bit of information about that in my book, including a couple of recipes. Recipe for bread and recipe for stew, and I talk a little bit about seasonings. But the nice thing is with video, I can show you a few other kinds of foods. So I've put some things together here on a tray, sort of like you would see in an offering scene on a tomb painting or a temple relief. Obviously, they wouldn't have put things in Tupperware containers or plastic wrap. But let's see what kinds of foods we eat today that the Egyptians had as well. First of all, bread, and I've just got a couple of rolls here, but bread was a staple for the Egyptians. They had 15 different words for it because they made several different kinds. Some had fruit filling, some were in loaves that were almost conical shape, and some were flatbread. They even had, interestingly enough, a kind of bread that we would call gluten-free, because they didn't always use wheat or barley for their flour. There were some kinds of bread that they made flour from either tubers or actually seeds from white lily plants. And there were Greek travelers who said that it was very good and very easy on the stomach. So if you have a gluten allergy, you can still eat gluten-free bread and be authentic. Now, another thing that you'll see in reliefs a lot is bunches of green onion. And onions were another staple in the Egyptian diet. And, you know, the funny thing is if you take fresh sliced onion and some of that Indian naan bread put together, it's really good. But some of their texts referred to onions as the white teeth of Horus. And, of course, if you look at, you know, these are just little bitty onion heads, but they're very white. I've heard of people observing rites called chewing onions for Horus or chewing onions for Sekhmet. To be honest with you, I have dug, and I'm not sure what that's referring to. But one thing I did learn about is there was a rite that they would do for the Feast of Sokar. And Sokar was a god of the underworld who later was associated with Osiris and with Ptah. But they would take onions, and probably what they had were dried up greens like these, and they would braid them and make garlands that they would wear and that they would offer to the dead on the Feast of Sokar. And it was called tying onions for Sokar. So that might be what they were referring to. And of course, if you let these dry out, you'd have plenty to braid. But another thing that they ate was chickpeas. And you can find chickpeas in the form of hummus. And you can get it these days at Walmart. It's funny, I have a friend who's a native. He's Palestinian, and he's very picky about his hummus. And if it comes out of a can, don't feed it to him. He'll know the difference. But chickpeas, interestingly enough, in the Egyptian language, they called them falcon's head beans, or falcon's eye in Coptic. And Plutarch, who was a Greek traveler during the Roman era, and he wrote what is probably our best reference for the myth of Osiris and Isis. He also wrote a little bit about some of the things that were done at festivals and offerings, and he mentioned that for the Feast of Horus the Child, they would offer fresh legumes, pulses. Well, maybe, especially given that these were called falcon's head beans, that might have been one of the things that they were offering. They might also have been offering another kind of bean. I've got this in a can. And the Arabic name is ful madamis. What's interesting is our modern name comes from the Egyptian name, because the Egyptian word for these kind of beans was pur, and the modern word is ful. So, kind of like Japanese, how they don't have the L sound in Japanese. The Egyptians didn't have it either. If you get your name written in hieroglyphics, the symbol for an L is actually an R in the original language. But Ken said Palestinian recipe, but ful madamis is considered the national dish of Egypt. And they have a saying that beans have satisfied even the pharaohs. So, That's one major source of protein, but don't think that the Egyptians were vegan. They weren't. They did eat meat. Uh, Fish was actually a pretty common source for most people. Uh, Chances are, if you've read a little bit about Egyptian religious practices and taboos, fish, especially certain kinds of fish, were considered taboo. It was unclean to eat one before going to do a service. But there were plenty of people who did eat fish. It's just there were certain kinds of fish that in different locales you wouldn't eat them. Another thing, we know that they ate pork because we found mummies that had trichinosis. Interestingly enough, they also ate some kind of weird things like hyena. Oddly enough, in Amarna, they have found skeletons of hyenas that show evidence of them, dressing the meat. They're cuts on the bones. And hyenas also carry trichinosis, so they could have had a pretty exotic diet. Another kind of meat that they had that I think you can find it in some places overseas, but not really here in America, would be gazelle. Of course, here in America, probably the closest thing that you could get to gazelle would be venison. And gazelle was offered to Hathor and also to Sekhmet. Now, what's for dessert? Let's see. The Egyptians had figs. There were actually a couple of different kinds that they had. And you can either find, I think you can find fig jam in the stores. That's one of my favorites is fig cookies. Fig Newtons, I used to eat those a bunch as a kid. Plutarch said that during the Feast of Jehuti, better known as Thoth, or Tote, if you want to stick with the Kemetic name, it's Jehuti, they would offer him figs and honey on his feast day. So, who knows, maybe the scribe of the gods had a little bit of a sweet tooth. One other sweetener that they used, and you really have to go to like an international section in your grocery store or a Middle Eastern grocery to find this, and this is carob syrup, carob molasses. Now, carob is a kind of tree. It looks sort of like an acacia, and you can see on the label these pods that it produces. They use that now to make a substitute for chocolate. And I'm not going to open it up, but it's very sticky, and it is kind of chocolatey, and they use it now on desserts. But it was also used as a sweetener, and there are also some medicinal remedies that the Egyptians used that started with carob pods. So, if this hasn't made you hungry, then, I don't know, well, maybe you've just eaten. But hopefully this will give you some interesting things to explore in your own cuisine, and also a few ideas for offerings. And hopefully this will help you with your Egyptian pagan or Kemetic practice. So for the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Synepti.